and Western New Jersey. This is WFMZ-TV.
From Easton, Pennsylvania, the 15th Congressional District Debates, presented by the Express Times and hosted by the State Theater Center for the Arts, and now the publisher of the Express Times, Martin Till.
Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the debate of the state. We're very glad you came out tonight. The rain held off, so the weather wasn't too bad to get in here. We're very glad you're here. This is a very important race this year. We're going to have all the candidates here for you to listen to and decide who you think is best for the job. And we are very pleased also tonight that this is being shown live on Channel 69. We'd like to thank our friends at Channel 69 for putting the time in and realizing the importance of this debate to the citizens of the Lehigh Valley. With that, to the Executive Director of the State Theater, Ms. Shelley Brown.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you so much. Thank you. And our thanks, of course, to the Express Times and to Channel 69 as well. This is becoming a regular event, and we're delighted that it's here at the State Theater. First, I'd like to introduce the panel. From the Express Times, Joseph P. Owens, editor. James S. Flagg, editorial page editor. Janice Blake Picotti, assistant editorial page editor. And Stephen Althouse, editor of the Allentown Times. Welcome to you. Thank you. And at my side, our trusty timekeeper, Jim Deegan, who is the managing editor of the Express Times. Now I'd like to introduce the candidates. Democrat, Joe Driscoll. Republican, Charlie Dent. Green Party, Greta Brown. And Libertarian, Rich Piotrowski. At this time, I'll give you a brief outline of our format. The questions will be posed by the panel to the candidates in alternating rotation. The candidates will have 2 minutes to answer the question. Each opponent will have 1 minute to address the same issue. We will continue in that sequence until we get to the questions presented by the candidates to each other. In that segment, each candidate will direct a question at a specific opponent. We only have 2 rules for this discussion. First, the candidates may not interrupt each other during the time allotted to respond, and we ask that the audience refrain from applause during the course of the debate. Each candidate has supporters in the audience, and they are welcome to congratulate them after the event. The purpose of tonight's gathering is to hear directly from the candidates. So thank you all in advance. We're looking forward to a lively discourse, and let's start with Mr. Owens to Mr. Driscoll.
Good evening. Mr. Driscoll, much has been made about your residency and the fact that you did not live here when you entered the race. Since then, you've purchased a home in Lower Macungie for $585,000, according to records in Lehigh County. The bulk of the people in the 15th District live in homes valued at a fraction of that. How can you tell people here that you can feel their pain and that your life experiences are similar to theirs?
Well, thank you for the opportunity. You know, across the course of this campaign, we have had the opportunity to talk about the issues, to talk about jobs being outsourced, to talk about health care being moved beyond the reach of so many families. And repeatedly, time and again, Charlie Dent wants to talk about one thing, the fact that I wasn't born here. Well, I chose to live in Allentown, and I'm happy to be living here. I'm here with my wife Alexandra and my 2 kids, Aiden and Allegra, and we believe that we have an opportunity to build a bright future, to start doing something about the problems that we all face. And the problems are not local to any particular corner of the 15th Congressional District. The problems we face are the problems of failed policies of the Bush administration that have outsourced our jobs, that have caused a rapid increase in the cost of health care, that have moved prescription drugs beyond the reach of our seniors. So I believe, and I've found, that not only have we received a warm welcome, but the fact of the matter is there's a clear choice here. There is the opportunity to continue in the direction of the Bush administration has taken us and the failed policies, or the opportunity to move in a new direction, start solving our problems, stop talking about them, and I plan to go to Washington and work with John Kerry to do just that.
Mr. Dent responds.
I want to thank the State Theater and the Express Times for hosting this wonderful forum. The question was about my opponent's residency. He turned the question into outsourcing. Well, it is true. My opponent is, in fact, the outsourced candidate. There are 140,000 Democratic registered voters in the 15th Congressional District, and he was selected by the Philadelphia Democratic leaders, power brokers, to run in this district. That is a fact. He did buy a house for approximately $600,000. He could probably afford to buy many houses. That's obvious. But buying a piece of property and calling this your home are not the same thing. You know, I'm running for Congress in large part because I care about this Commonwealth, this country, and this community. I've been shaped by the values, the traditions, the institutions, the culture, and most importantly, the people of this community. You know, this election, do we want somebody representing us who just showed up here, who sees us as his speed bump on his road to Congress? That's not what it's about. The people expect us to be of and among the community that we will be representing in Washington. Thank you.
Ms. Brown.
I also want to thank the State Theater and the Express Times for your invitation for me to be here this evening, and I thank the audience for being here as well as the viewers. It's a pleasure to speak with you. I have no issue with Joe Driscoll's being here, and I welcome him to this race. If he can convince the people of the Lehigh Valley, the 15th District, that he can represent them well, more power to him. I also would like to try to convince you that I can represent you well. I've lived here in the Lehigh Valley for over 20 years. I love the Lehigh Valley, and I've been active in many different ways here in the Lehigh Valley. I bring with me the principles of the Green Party, which are very strong and comprehensive issues in defense of the environment and social justice in all the issues. Thank you.
Mr. Piotrowski.
Thank you. The worst part about going last to the first question is I have to be the person that says, I also thank you for inviting us here this evening and welcome everyone here. As far as this issue goes, this issue illustrates everything that's wrong with politics today. We have a campaign that there are two candidates that are spending well in excess of $1 million, and they will argue over something that is totally a non-issue. I know one thing for a fact, and that is that all four of us currently reside in this district. But even if Joe Driscoll didn't choose to move to this district, there's nothing illegal about that. It's because the way the Constitution is written, he is actually representing the state of Pennsylvania. He would be one of Pennsylvania's congregation, the congressional delegation, rather, to Congress. And so it's a non-issue.
Thank you. Our next question, Mr. Flagg, for Mr. Dent.
Mr. Dent, the federal government and all but a few states have banned same-sex marriages, and now Congress is trying to prevent states from even recognizing such unions that are legal elsewhere. Do you support the right of people of the same sex to form legal, lifelong, committed relationships, and if not as marriages, as legally sanctioned civil unions?
As a state legislator, I voted with the overwhelming majority for the Defense of Marriage Act, or DOMA. That act defines marriage as a bond between one man and one woman. That is what I support. I certainly do understand that people of the same sex can get in committed relationships, and I believe it's important that we all be tolerant and allow people, certainly respect their way of life. But having said that, you know, I do understand that I don't want 4 judges in my opponent's home state of Massachusetts redefining marriage for the entire nation. My preference is for this to be a state issue, but unfortunately the Massachusetts Supreme Court has forced this issue once again onto the national agenda. We may need to take serious steps at some point to correct the Massachusetts decision.
Ms. Brown, you may respond.
I find that in no way does the love relationship of a gay couple or a lesbian couple threaten marriage. In fact, I support 100% that the rights of gays and lesbians to live together, to be married, to have all the rights that occur to other couples. And I find that it is an issue that is very divisive. But how can you even think of writing an amendment that would ban something so fine as love? How can you move in that direction? We have many, many other issues to pay attention to. So my final word is yes, I certainly support the right of gays and lesbians to lifelong unions or marriages.
Mr. Piotrowski.
In all the areas that government sticks its nose into, the area of management is probably the most offensive to me. When I got married to my beautiful wife, Ellen, who's sitting out there in the audience tonight, I resented the fact that I, in essence, had to go and get permission from the government to marry her. She often asked the question when we had to take a blood test to get married, what would have happened if they said no? Would we still have gotten married? Years ago, actually more than a couple centuries ago, the idea of marriage licenses was originated to stop interracial marriages. Now today, we think of that as an insane idea, that government would sit there and tell a man and a woman, just because one happens to be black and the other happens to be white, that the state is not going to give them permission to marry. I think it's equally offensive that government tells anyone who they can fall in love with.
Mr. Driscoll.
I support the extension of all rights to homosexual couples. What's really wrong here is the fact that the Bush administration, and in an election year, has chosen this issue to make it as a divisive issue, a way to try to achieve a political victory and divide the country at the same time. That is the only reason that the constitutional amendment has been proposed. And I unequivocally am opposed to the constitutional amendment. The Constitution was created to protect our rights and liberties, and the idea that it would be used to take away some rights from a particular group is wrong, and it must be stopped. I will work tirelessly to oppose that effort to create a constitutional amendment to ban gay marriage.
Thank you. Mr. Althouse now has a question for Ms. Brown.
Good evening to everyone. Ms. Brown, with portions of the Patriot Act up for renewal in 2005, do you believe certain powers granted to the government infringe upon the constitutional rights of Americans?
I do. I believe that the Patriot Act rises up out of a politics of fear. I believe that the government has moved into restricting liberties. I think there are many Americans, especially Americans of color, and of lower income, many students who feel that they are their liberties are lessened, and I think that it sets a very bad precedent to move in this direction of curtailing rights, of looking over the citizen's shoulder, of moving into the private life of citizens. I am in support of those communities throughout the country that have banned or rejected in their communities the powers of the Patriot Act, and I hope that we can do that here in the Lehigh Valley. And if I am in Congress, I will do my best to let the sunset upon the Homeland Security Act when the time comes. There are many security issues. I believe that the laws that we had in place before 9/11 were adequate for the security of this country. They were not enforced. There was not care taken. Many things that could have been paid attention to were not. I think that if we tighten up the laws that we had before 9/11, if we pay attention to the security of the country, that we do not need new laws that curtail the freedoms of our citizens.
Thank you. Mr. Piotrowski?
To pick up where Greta left off on that, the problem with the sunset provision of the Patriot Act is the sun will set on only certain provisions of it, and it will not do away with the entire bill. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to sit down with Bob Barr, that's the former congressman from Georgia, who was one of the people who voted for the Patriot Act, and he told me that he regretted voting for it. And he's not only told this to me, this wasn't a confidential conversation, because he's going around the country now speaking out against the Patriot Act. He was a man who has the courage and the conviction to say, I voted for it because I got caught up in the reaction, the overreaction to the tragedy of 9/11. So he voted on a bill, like most of his fellow congressmen at the time, that he did not read. But once he had a chance to review this bill, he realized that this is the most un-American bill that has ever passed in the House of Congress, and it should be repealed.
Mr. Driscoll?
There are important provisions in the Patriot Act that allow for the sharing of information that are working to make us safer. And there's no question that the need for this came about as a result of the world changing on September 11th, and we need to continue to find ways to improve upon our intelligence sharing and to make our world more secure. But I'm concerned about the Patriot Act. There are provisions in which that do not need to be renewed, and there's no question that John Ashcroft has misused parts of the Patriot Act. And our single and sole responsibility is not just to follow along blindly behind Republican leadership that's potentially misusing parts of this law, but to be a clear voice for the people of the 15th Congressional, to protect our rights and liberties.
And Mr. Dent.
Yeah, I've worked very closely with our former Governor Tom Ridge and currently our Homeland Security Secretary. The Patriot Act will come up for reauthorization shortly. I understand that based on experience, we may need to make some revisions or changes to the Patriot Act. But let us not forget what the Patriot Act has done. It has helped us apprehend terrorists across the globe. It provides for assistance to victims of terrorist attacks. It allows the CIA and the FBI to talk to one another. And the 9/11 Commission report told us how critical it is that we share information better between the 15 intelligence gathering agencies. We need to replace this notion of need to know with need to share. And again, while I understand the need for some revisions to the Patriot Act, we will reauthorize it because it has been effective in this war against terrorism.
Thank you. Ms. Blake-Picotti, a question for Mr. Piotrowski.
Good evening, everyone. Mr. Piotrowski, the rising cost of health care is forcing some of our senior citizens to choose between keeping warm in the winter and buying the medicines they desperately need to live healthy and pain-free. It is forcing people with chronic illnesses to go without medications and the preventative care that sustains lives. It is crippling both families and employers who are being crushed by ever-increasing costs. Is a national health care system part of the solution? If not, what is?
Thank you for asking that question. It's a very important question because it's one that's on a lot of people's mind. It's one that affects me personally as I have to write that check because I'm campaigning full-time. I have to write a check for our health insurance for myself and my wife every month. It's also one that we know firsthand as far as the rising cost of prescription drugs because both my mother and my mother-in-law both have an extensive list of drugs that they have to purchase each month. And so they know the cost of those, and I hear the stories. However, when I look at the problem, I don't want to just come up with another patchwork answer to this and throw more money at it, expecting that to fix it. What I ask, and what I will ask in Congress when I'm your representative, is why is the cost going up? Why is it that here in Allentown we can drive down Route 22 and see that billboard that advertises LASIK surgery? I'm sure several people here know someone who had LASIK surgery done a few years back when it used to run about $4,000 or $5,000. Why is it LASIK surgery is being advertised on billboards and in the front page on the comics section in some cases of the Sunday newspapers? Why is it that it's being advertised now for $2,000, in some cases $1,000, where it used to be $5,000? Because LASIK surgery is a little bit different than most surgical procedures in America, and the same thing with prescription drugs. It is not regulated in the same manner. There are more free market forces affecting LASIK surgery. That's why it's being advertised. There's competition. Competition always brings down the cost. If you have one single store in a town and somebody else opens up, another food store opens up in town, I guarantee you prices will go down. Every shopper here knows that and has personally experienced it. That's why we need the free market to enter into healthcare, not more government bureaucracy that's going to drive the cost up further and make life more difficult for seniors like my parents.
Mr. Driscoll.
We're in a health care crisis, and one of the most dramatic differences you'll see is the policies of the Bush administration that Charlie Dent fully supports, policies that over the last 4 years have led to the number of uninsured in this state to grow from 1 million to 1,400,000. We're moving in the wrong direction. The answer is not a government-mandated health care. The answer is to make health care accessible and affordable to all Americans. And the first way that we can do that is to fix the Medicare law that was passed under the Bush leadership and passed by the Republican leaders in Congress that Charlie Dent 100% supports. We've got to fix that Medicare law because the largest component of the cost of health care is the cost of prescription drugs now. And we all know it. Prescription drugs are going through the roof. By using the power of the federal government, we can bargain on behalf of Medicare beneficiaries and lower the price of prescription drugs. We can bring down the cost of health care, and I plan to do that.
Mr. Dan?
Yeah, a government-run health care system is not the answer to our health care problems. I agree with Joe Driscoll on one thing. We do have a health care crisis, and it is driven in large part by the medical liability crisis that we're experiencing here in eastern Pennsylvania. I support comprehensive medical liability reform, H.R. 5, introduced by Congressman Jim Greenwood of Bucks County. That imposes caps on non-economic damages, also caps contingency fees, protects your ability to get compensatory damages. We need to do that. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that if we enact that legislation, we could see as much as a 30% reduction in medical liability premiums, and we could save Medicare about $11 billion over 10 years. Real savings. We need to do that. My opponent opposes that legislation, Mr. Driscoll. He is with the trial lawyers. I'm being supported by the medical community, many in the hospital community. I'm proud of that fact, and I have a strong record on prescription drugs, voting 3 times to expand prescription drug assistance for Pennsylvania seniors.
Ms. Brown.
I support a national health care program for all Americans. It wouldn't need to be reduced to that. You don't need to be mandated to accept the government policy, the national care. But I want to make it very clear. I stand here tonight representing the poor and the vulnerable. And I am in very good health. But if, God forbid, I would need, in my older years, which are beginning now, if I would need thousands and thousands of dollars of treatment, I would not want that treatment if it would take it away from a child, from a student, from a young person, from a couple, parents of young children. If it meant that my having that treatment denied it to someone else, I would not accept it. I want to stand here for compassion.
Mr. Owens, a question for Mr. Dent, please.
Mr. Dent, the war in Iraq has taken a heavy toll on people in this country and in our area. It's an issue that has divided the country in this presidential race and has no clear conclusion. Many people want to know when our commitment there will end. As a newly elected congressman, and if you were given the opportunity to advise the president, would you recommend an exit strategy, and how would you do it, and how long will it take?
Well, we simply at this point don't know how long it will take to extricate ourselves from Iraq. But what I would advise to the president is this, that we must make sure that there is a full transition to sovereignty in Iraq so that Iraq can embrace democratic institutions. That is absolutely critical. We need to make sure that the Iraqi security forces are able to maintain stability and order in their country prior to our departure. I fear, that we set artificial deadlines and perhaps depart too prematurely, that there could be massive genocide, fratricide. It would be unspeakable crimes against humanity, mortal crimes could be committed. And I believe we will be able to extricate ourselves. We've just had an election in Afghanistan last week. There will be elections in Iraq shortly, and Mr. Alawi has said that we could have elections in Iraq in 15 out of the 18 provinces right now. I look forward to those elections, and then ultimately the peaceful transition of power to the Iraqi authorities. But there's no easy answer. There's not going to be in this war against terror, there is not going to be a signing ceremony, a surrender ceremony on the battleship Missouri like there was at the conclusion of the Second World War. We're in this war against terrorism for the long haul, and I look forward to the day when we can bring our men and women home from Iraq. I've seen the faces of the men and women of the 213th Area Support Group who were out of Allentown, the Guardsmen and women, as they were deployed. I saw that. I saw what the families went through. Most of those folks went to Afghanistan. I saw them return. I was delighted that so many of them returned home safely. So I understand the sacrifices that our people are making. As the Vice Chairman of the Senate Veterans Affairs and Emergency Preparedness Committee, I've had a strong working relationship with many of our National Guards men and women, and also with our first responders. Thank you.
Ms. Brown.
If I had been in Congress, I would have voted against the war from the very start. Now that we are engaged in this war, if I were able to advise the President of the United States, I would say, let's get out. Let's bring our troops home and also bring our profiteers home. The politics of our administration are politics of greed, politics of pride, politics of world dominance. Some Americans, not the majority, are determined to control the markets, control the workforce of the world, and they are willing to use our military troops, our military force, to maintain that dominance. I do not believe that we should do that. I do not question the loyalty and courage of our troops, but I say bring them home now.
Mr. Piotrowski.
There's several problems I have with this whole Iraq war issue. First off, we never went to war with Iraq. Congress gave the president a blank check to pretty much attack whoever he wanted to, in essence. But beyond that, we did a preemptive strike against the nation. We did a lot of harm, and we should do the honorable thing and admit we made a mistake, to the world, and turn around and pull our troops out. Now, that does not mean that I'm an isolationist in any way, shape, or form. I have talked to countless thousands of people in the course of the last several months, and I don't think there's one single person I've met that wouldn't fight to the death to defend this country, including myself, and I would include my three opponents here in that category. I think that they would fight to the death to defend this country. The problem was, in Iraq, we were not attacked by Iraq, nor would we have ever been attacked by Iraq, in my opinion.
Mr. Driscoll.
I think if this conversation had taken place between George Bush and Charlie Dent, George Bush would have been very happy because he heard exactly what he's saying back from Charlie Dent. This is the problem. We need leadership, not following. And the problem with the war in Iraq with George Bush and the failure of this administration is they're unwilling to admit that there's a problem. Of course, we all know that there's a problem. We know we were misled into the war, and we know that we need a change in leadership. And that's why I look forward to November 2nd, because I believe on November 2nd we're going to see the country overwhelmingly support John Kerry as the next president. Now, in the congressional race, the choice is clear, because Charlie Dent is doing nothing other than blindly following the president and blindly following this failed plan in Iraq. There is still no plan for getting out of Iraq. What we need to do, John Kerry's got a great plan, is we need to shift the responsibility of securing Iraq to Iraqis.
Mr. Flagg, a question for Ms. Brown.
Ms. Brown, the amount of garbage being imported into Pennsylvania has doubled in the last 5 years, and the Lehigh Valley is one of the leading importers of out-of-state trash. Local, county, and state officials are at a loss to do anything because this is an interstate commerce issue. What would you do to give states more control over the flow of garbage and make exporting states more responsible for disposing of their trash?
There are a number of things. 2 years ago, the Green Party candidate for governor here in Pennsylvania stood here in this place and spoke of a plan which later Governor Rendell said was actually a very good plan, and that would be to require that cities and localities that ship trash to Pennsylvania be required to meet certain standards. I don't remember exactly what, but one of the ideas is that they would have to have a very strong recycling program, so that if New York City would want to ship its garbage to Pennsylvania, it would first need to place a strong recycling program in place. And there are other measures that I think could be implemented. But even beyond that, I think that we need to look at the ways that we, throughout the country, generate trash. And this is one of the ways that the government could, the U.S. government could take some leadership in helping us cut trash at the source, the packaging, the certainly much more recycling, have countrywide programs for recycling glass, and in every way cutting and eliminating the generation of the kind of trash that we have, that we generate all the time in the United States. So I think that this would be the direction to go. Cut the generation of garbage at the source and implement strict requirements for cities before they can export their trash.
Mr. Piotrowski.
I have to admit, in the course of my campaigning, no one's brought this up as an issue to me, so I'm a little bit surprised by it being asked, because I don't think it's something that's really a day-to-day concern. I know in Nevada, people there are very, very upset over what the federal government is doing with the nuclear waste. That's an issue that really has Nevadans upset over that. My general answer to it is that the federal government should not be getting involved in it, because I do agree with the ruling that it does fall under the Interstate Commerce Clause. This should be left to the states. The federal government should not be sticking its nose in these essentially state areas. But I can add to it in one area, is that as far as looking at the general category of, or the general problem of pollution in general, is that the biggest chemical polluter in the United States is the United States government.
Mr. Driscoll.
I believe this is a state issue, but I'd say it's one of the most embarrassing statistics Pennsylvania has. I love this state, and one of the reasons why I decided to run for Congress is I wanted to change the direction we were moving in. We know that we share several places and statistics that are embarrassing. One, this importing of trash. Two, we're the number 1 or 2 year in and year out exporter of college graduates. The failure is a failure of political leadership, and while Charlie Dent was in Harrisburg, nothing's been done on this front. What we need to do is craft a regional vision of where we want to go. Because if we're creating economic growth that's smart, that invests in our cities, that increases tax revenue by growing, which is, I've got a detailed economic development plan that I plan to bring to bear here, we can change these statistics and we can move in the right direction again, and I look forward to doing that.
Mr. Dent.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Driscoll just demonstrated his lack of knowledge and experience on this issue. The United States Supreme Court has ruled that the U.S. Congress must pass legislation allowing states to regulate the flow of household waste. It's an interstate commerce issue. Congressman Jim Greenwood of Bucks County, once again, has introduced legislation over the years that has been blocked by the New York delegation in the U.S. Congress that would allow states to regulate household waste. We'd love to regulate it at the state level, but we simply do not have the authority because of what the United States Supreme Court has stated. And your friends in New York, Senator Clinton and Senator Schumer, they should allow that legislation to be considered, because New York wants to send their trash elsewhere. They don't want to be responsible for the disposition of their own trash. When they shut down the major landfill up in Staten Island, that created an enormous problem for Pennsylvania. And we need help from the federal government, and I intend to stand shoulder to shoulder to pass meaningful legislation to allow the states to engage in flow control.
Mr. Althouse, a question for Mr. Piotrowski.
Mr. Piotrowski, some people argue that proportion tax breaks spur the economy, while others argue it increases the federal deficit. Would you vote to make President Bush's 2001 and 2003 tax cuts permanent, and why or why not?
Thank you. I would not vote to make them permanent only because he did not cut taxes. All he did was defer them. In my household, perhaps it's just that my wife is a little bit smarter than the average shopper. She knows that if I say go out and buy something on the credit card and say, don't worry, honey, I didn't spend the money, because when the bill comes due, I'm going to pay the Visa card with the MasterCard. And when the MasterCard comes due a month later, I'm going to pay that with the American Express card. So I really didn't spend the money. The fact is, George Bush has increased spending more than any other president since Lyndon Johnson. That's a fact. So just because he deferred taxes, in other words, he said, I'm not going to tax you today, but we'll surely tax you tomorrow. That's not giving you a tax cut. So what you have to do first is cut the spending, because cutting taxes without cutting the spending is meaningless, because the taxes will still be there. They will have to be paid at some point in time. Currently, the United States government is spending $3 for every $2 it's taking in. In the lame duck session in Congress, they're going to have to vote to raise the debt ceiling. You notice they won't do it before. They wouldn't do it before Congress closed before the election. They're going to push it off into the lame duck session, and they have lied repeatedly about the cost of things. It's a proven fact that they lied when the Republicans ramrodded through this Medicare prescription bill. They lied on the numbers. They forced the actuaries of the Medicaid department to misrepresent the numbers. So there was no tax cut. There was just a pushing the burden onto your children. And I asked these representatives of both major parties, how dare you sit there and try to claim power to sit by pushing the burden onto people's children? How dare you?
Mr. Driscoll.
I'm opposed to making the Bush tax cuts permanent. You know, the problem with the Bush tax cuts was that they enormously favored a few at the expense of many, and we know because they contributed. This is the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office saying they contributed 25% at least to the deficit we're running up. Now, I am not in favor, as I have said, of rolling back all the tax cuts. I am in favor of supporting the plan that John Kerry's put forward, which is that we can adjust the tax policy to accelerate tax cuts for the middle class, and we can pay for that largely by closing the tax loopholes that have favored the wealthiest corporations that have shipped jobs offshore. So we can capture more revenue, but we need to get on sound fiscal footing. It's absolutely essential, and we won't get there with a vote for the Bush agenda and the Bush tax cuts, which is what we would have in Charlie Dent. I'm offering an alternative.
Mr. Dent?
Thank you. What you just heard from Mr. Driscoll is what we call a flip-flop. He told the editorial board of the Easton Express that he'd vote to make the Bush tax cuts permanent. That's what he said in the spring. He said that. And now he condemns those very same tax cuts. I do support those tax cuts. I believe they've had a stimulative effect on the economy. You know, the child tax credit has been expanded. The marriage penalty to be eliminated. Lowering the marginal income tax rates, a new rate at 10%, cut taxes for working families, lower income working families. I support those tax cuts. But I guess the question for us today, you know, why did Mr. Driscoll change his position on this issue over the past few months? It's because the leaders in Washington told him to change his position. He talks about rubber stamps, but, you know, it's quite clear he can't stand up to some of the Democratic leaders who have been pushing him to run in this district, in a district where he's never lived.
Ms. Brown?
I oppose the tax cuts. I believe they are unfair. They benefit a small minority of wealthy Americans. And I believe that wealth is made on the backs of workers. I believe that workers need to see the fruits of their work here in America. We have such a strong tradition of work, of equality, and to give tax cuts to the wealthy is so blatantly wrong that I believe they need to be repealed. I believe in taxes. I believe that all Americans should contribute at the level of their ability to building and maintaining America and keeping its programs in place and having programs and network for the poor and the vulnerable.
Thank you. Now, Ms. Blake-Picotti, a question for Mr. Driscoll.
Mr. Driscoll, Democrats keep telling us what's wrong with the No Child Left Behind Act. Essentially, that it's another federally mandated program that isn't fully funded, that hamstrings our public schools and increases property taxes. Tell us what's good about it and what you would do to make it better.
No Child Left Behind has been a useful piece of legislation as it was crafted and as it got support across the aisle from Senator Kennedy and others, in that it's not only set goals and standards to bring up all our students, but it would provide new funding, new resources to reach those students. The criticism we have is that new funding never arrived, so that new requirements were put on schools and on teachers, and at the same time the funding wasn't there to help them achieve the goals. Unfortunately, what we've learned is that we need to meet our commitments, and under the Bush leadership and the Republican Congress, they feel comfortable saying one thing and doing another, and that's undermining an opportunity for a quality education in our school system. What we need to do is fulfill our commitment under No Child Left Behind. Currently, the gap is $7.5 billion, and I want to go further. I want to find ways to get the best teachers going into the most troubled schools. Instead of just penalizing schools that aren't making the grade, we should find a way to solve the problem, and I look forward to trying to do that as the next congressman from the 15th Congressional District. We don't have to continue to have programs like No Child Left Behind that are just a good idea. We can stop talking about our problems and start solving them if we're willing to fulfill our commitments under Democratic leadership, and we will start moving in that direction.
Mr. Dent?
Yeah, the goals of No Child Left Behind are certainly laudable. I support high standards and greater accountability in basic education. There have been some difficulties with the implementation of No Child Left Behind. I believe that administrative remedies are certainly appropriate to the Act. For example, many school districts have approached me about the graduation and attendance requirements. They were too rigid. The districts were meeting their goals in terms of reading and math and the core subjects, but they were not meeting their AYPs with respect to graduation and attendance. Well, we corrected that administratively. I met just last week with Governor Rendell's nominee for Secretary of Education, Francis Barnes, and we had an in-depth discussion about what we should do to make this act better and stronger. Well, he strongly supports it, and the Rendell administration strongly supports it. What we discovered, too, is that some students are meeting their goals in special ed but not meeting them in No Child Left Behind. We need to make those two acts more consistent. I hope we can do that administratively. We may have to do it legislatively. I will be discussing this with Chairman John Boehner very shortly.
Ms. Brown.
This administration is notorious for creating these titles for programs and naming what they're going to do, and then behind the scenes not doing anything like what the title implies. Not only is this program underfunded, the No Child Left Behind, but many, many teachers are against it. It does not reveal knowledge of teachers, of children, of the learning needs of the children throughout the country. And one of the ways that this administration and all of us in America are leaving children behind is due to poverty. Children that are poor and hungry are going to be left behind. And another way that we are leaving children behind is by showing them such violence on a daily basis. We have a tremendously violent society, and we need to fix that for our children.
Mr. Piotrowski.
No one can argue that the quality of education has gone downhill over the years. We used to be first in the world as far as our education goes. And what's happened is the federal government has, year after year after year, has kept sticking its nose into it more and more. It used to be, there was a president once, maybe you might remember him, his name was Ronald Reagan. He was a Republican. He called for abolishing the Federal Department of Education. You don't hear that kind of talk from Republicans anymore. Now you hear the kind of talk from Charlie Dent and his clone, in a sense, George Bush, who wanted the federal government more involved in education. On the state level, Charlie Dent has received a D rating from the Commonwealth Foundation because he's not interested in these, what used to be considered core limited government roles. He's pushed for a bill on the state level called an Ounce Prevention Act, which I encourage everyone to read that bill and find out what's in that bill.
Thank you. We move to our next portion of this evening's debate. The next two questions come from business organizations and will be presented by Martin Till, who is the publisher of the Express-Times. Each candidate has 1 minute to respond. Mr. Till?
Mr. Dent, this question was submitted by the Greater Lehigh Valley Chamber of Commerce. Many business owners feel the tax and regulatory system stifles competition. If elected to Congress, what policies or initiatives would you put forth to help businesses thrive in the Lehigh Valley?
Thank you, Mr. Till. I want to first point out that my candidacy has been endorsed by the National Federation of Independent Business and the United States Chamber of Commerce because of my strong record in support of meaningful tax cuts that help many small businesses. I have cut the state capital stock and franchise tax, the #1 priority of small business in Pennsylvania. My opponent, Mr. Driscoll, has condemned me and criticized me for cutting the capital stock and franchise tax. It is critically important. I believe that we can do at the federal level is basically making sure that small business people can keep more of their money in their own pocket so that they can reinvest in their companies. They need capital to grow. I've been a strong leader on tort reform, workers' compensation reform, energy deregulation, tax cuts, as I mentioned. So I have a very strong record in this area, and I'm proudly supported by all these various business organizations, small business people. My sister and brother-in-law each have a small manufacturing company in Quakertown. I understand what the problems are. My in-laws are in the construction business. Thank you.
Ms. Brown?
Two ways that I think we could help the business people of the Lehigh Valley is to revisit the NAFTA and GATT treaties and other such treaties and limit the ways that the regional businesses are curtailed by the global business. So we need to revisit that. The second way that I think we could help the local businesses is to look at health care. Health premiums are one of the most difficult issues for businesses. Businesses who wish to take care of their employees well cannot afford to offer them the kind of health care they need. Therefore, a national health care would be of tremendous help to businesses. I also favor not tax breaks, but government incentives for small businesses.
Mr. Piotrowski?
Thank you. Last week, I spoke with a small businessman here in Pennsylvania who was telling me he'd like to hire 2 more people. Now, in America, the interesting statistic is 80% of all jobs are created by small businesses, yet that's what we're burdening with the taxes in America. What happens is the politicians will tax the living daylights out of these small businesses and put burdens of regulations on them, and then what they'll do is they'll show up at these nice public events with these big publishers' clearinghouse checks with a $300 corporate welfare check. For example, recently, Federal Express got $32 million in set-asides to help them build a hub down in the Carolinas. Now, Federal Express, I think it can afford it to build their 3rd hub. Otherwise, what are they going to do? Stop expanding their business?
Mr. Driscoll.
Sammy Chute has a company called S&S Industries in Allentown, and a couple of weeks ago I walked through his business with Governor Rendell. He employs 25 people. He manufactures furniture, and he is a perfect example of the bind that small businesses are caught in. He can barely afford to offer health care to his 25 employees. To his credit, each year he finds a way to do it, but it's a struggle, and he can't grow his business. I've got a detailed economic development plan that Sammy Chute and others have embraced because it offers a $100,000 small business investment tax credit, 4 times what it is currently, and it will enable him to buy new machinery, to hire new employees. I have a health care tax credit that will offset 50% of the cost of health care for new employees. This will help him extend and hire new employees and grow his business.
Mr. Till?
We're coming back to health care, so this is good. This question was submitted by the Two Rivers Area Chamber of Commerce. Access to affordable, high-quality health care coverage for businesses and their employees must be improved. Business owners have experienced 5 consecutive years of double-digit increases in health care premiums, which have eroded their ability to attract and keep qualified workers, decreasing their competitiveness and limited their ability to grow. With health care coverage being the most sought-after benefit offered by employers, what can you comment on tax incentives, market stimulation, or other remedies to help make health insurance more affordable for employers? Ms. Brown.
I pay about $9,000 a year for health insurance. I have to pay for it directly because I'm in a profession where it's not covered by the employer. But the employers that need to pay or help their employees pay for health insurance, it's a tremendous burden. And that is why I support the Green Party platform, as I have told you, that is for universal single-payer health care for all Americans. And if the government took maybe half of that $9,000 that I now pay and applied it to a universal national health care, I think that would go a long ways in supporting it. So I'm willing to pay higher taxes to support national health care.
Mr. Piotrowski.
Thank you. I often wonder why it is that this became a benefit when it did. Because employers don't offer automobile insurance as a benefit. It all evolved over a way of getting around, as is often what happens, is businesses will figure a way of getting around the tax burden that's put on them. So going back a few decades ago, it became popular to offer these benefit packages which started circumventing the high income tax rates because these circumvented those laws. So that's the unintended consequences of putting these tax burdens on the businesses, and then you create and you establish these loopholes in a sense that they get around, and you get the government further and further involved with it. Fast forward 50 years later, we're at a crisis point where no one can afford anything anymore as far as insurance goes. In my household, we pay about $700 a month that we have to write a check every month. And it's because of the government getting involved in this area. We need to get the government back out and introduce free market forces in this area.
Mr. Driscoll?
As I've walked around and talked to business owners, the number one reason why they are slow or will not hire new employees is the cost of health care. I was just talking about S&S Industries, but the problem is true across the district and across the country. This problem has only worsened as the Republicans have been in leadership down in Washington and under the Bush administration. They simply turn their back on it and are not interested in providing solutions. And unfortunately, we have no new ideas from Charlie Dent, who sat by on the sidelines and did nothing. It is why I've created the health care tax credit that offsets 50% of the cost of health care for small business employees. It's critical, and we need to start making changes that will enable employers to hire new employees, to grow their businesses, while we work aggressively to rein in health care costs and make health care accessible and affordable to all of us.
Mr. Dan.
Certainly, the cost of health care is a critical issue to small business. I was recently named the champion of manufacturing by the Manufacturers Resource Center because of my understanding of this issue and others that are very important to manufacturers. Do you realize in Easton Hospital has lost its entire neurosurgery department because of medical liability premiums? I've stated earlier that I support meaningful medical malpractice reform, which my opponent opposes, that will cut costs. My opponent doesn't believe that the medical liability crisis is driving up health care costs. As much as $100 billion annually is spent on defensive medicine practices because physicians are prescribing tests and procedures that they're just doing that to protect themselves in the event that they're sued. That is one thing we can do that can lower costs quickly and immediately. Second, association health plans. I feel very strongly small businesses need the ability, like large companies have now, to get greater discounts. Associations, whether they be builders or realtors, should be able to work across state lines so they can realize greater savings and find lower cost premiums for their employees.
Thank you. We've reached the candidate question portion of the evening. Each candidate directs a question at a specific opponent. For example, Mr. Piotrowski to Ms. Brown. 2 minutes will be allotted for the answer. There is no rebuttal time in this period. Each candidate will be given 2 minutes to make a closing statement at the end of the questioning. And Mr. Piotrowski, will start with you.
Okay, thank you again. My question is to Mr. Dent. Charlie, in this race, you repeatedly, and you've sat here today, repeatedly keep referring to your opponent. Now, perhaps it's that you're not good with math, but I count that there's 4 of us standing up here, so there should be a little S at the end of opponent. Now, I'm asking you a direct yes or no question here. You've been rated a D by the Commonwealth Foundation. You've talked about supporting the policies of President Bush, which we all know has increased the size and scope and cost of government, larger than any president since Lyndon Johnson. In a yes or no answer, is the reason that you're ignoring me in this race because I am the only true fiscal conservative here?
Well, he won't get his yes or no answer, but the reason why he's at this debate is because I said I felt that the 2 smaller party candidates should be allowed to participate. So I want you to be aware of that. That's the first thing. Second, that was quite a long statement, but what I will tell you is I am running on my record. I am proud of my record, and I'll tell you what, I've just been energized by the support I've received from people in this community. In fact, your question, again, really didn't go anywhere. We can talk about the Commonwealth Foundation. They've written many nice articles and thanked me for my votes on various issues over the years. I do have fiscal conservative credentials that everyone knows about. I've cut taxes 7 times by $6.8 billion. Tax cuts that have helped small business people, small farmers, working families, working family tax cuts. I'm very proud of that record, and I stand on it.
Mr. Driscoll.
Being in the lead, if not just temporarily, but being in the lead is a distinct honor. So to Mr. Dent, we heard last night from George Bush that his #1 priority should he get 4 more years, is to privatize Social Security. Now, we know that you accepted $10,000 in campaign contributions from Tom DeLay, the same Tom DeLay who was admonished 4 times in the last 6 days for violations by the House Ethics Committee. I want to know, because you've said that you are against the privatization of Social Security, but should you win and George Bush and Tom DeLay come to you and ask you for your vote, I want to know that you're going to vote against Tom DeLay as your leader and against the privatization of Social Security, because I don't believe that it's credible. And just to preempt your